Hello, I'm Deyan Sudjic. I did train to be an architect, but I realized that the idea of architecture and the materiality of it are two different things, and I really admire architects who have that skill to turn their ideas about space into materiality. But I spent my life as a critic, a curator, a journalist, and most recently as the director of the Design Museum in London, where every day you face up to some of the issues that I'm talking about today. The question of ethics, which is a really tough topic to think about, especially in the light of this morning's session and the climate emergency which this university declared last year. On one level, one would think that actually talking about form or shape or space or architecture in the sense that Zaha Hadid here understood it is somehow irrelevant and a distraction from the one task we have, which is survival. And I'm not sure I see it that way, and I think it's important always to remember what the meaning of architecture is and what it can offer and what it can do. So I'm going to try and address the idea of ethics in building, in architecture, from a number of viewpoints. It's the contested meanings people have of architecture that sometimes creates the most problems. Zaha, who sadly died 5 years ago, spent the first 10 years of her career desperately trying to persuade anyone to build any of her ideas, which were at that time seen as being hopelessly impractical and unbuildable. But when, of course, she actually did manage to build, and this is a arts and cultural centre in Baku, there were two very different meanings. For Hadid, this was actually the realization of an extraordinary, vivid imagination about space and form and the way that architecture can have a presence as sculpture. But from another point of view, this was a celebration of an autocratic regime built out of the ruins of the Soviet Union with a president for whom this building is named, who was a former head of the KGB in Azerbaijan. And it's a label that once applied to Zaha was quite hard to shift. This is one of the many football stadiums now being built in Qatar. And even before this project actually started, Zaha was accused of presiding over the deaths of a number of unfortunate Bangladeshi migrant workers here. Since she hadn't actually started building it yet, it was a somewhat unjustified accusation. It's an issue which plagues many, not plagues, it's an issue which does shape the careers of so many architects. Rem Koolhaas, for example, would see this as a brilliant reinvention of the skyscraper. It's a monument in Beijing which is distinguished not by height but by form. But for his critics, like Ian Baruma, the writer, this is, of course, the celebration of a regime that is oppressing its citizens, and this is the headquarters of Central China Television, which, of course, is an organization which tells 1 billion Chinese what to think. David Chipperfield is the architect of the Chinese embassy in London. For him, this is an exercise in elegant town planning, of respecting the historic setting of the Tower of London and the Royal Mint. But for those who are opposed to China, this is another example of presenting an acceptable face to a very unacceptable regime. There are also architects whose own personal histories one has to call into question. Philip Johnson famously introduced the world to the idea of the postmodern skyscraper, but in an earlier stage of his career, between setting up the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA and training as an architect at Harvard, he spent 3 years as a full-time organizing fascist. He accompanied the German army on their invasion of Poland and wrote home in glowing terms about what a glorious spectacle it was. Or from the other political perspective, this is Hannes Meyer, the second director of the Bauhaus, who was he actually managed to really start the architecture course at the Bauhaus, and he believed in a rigidly functionalist view of what architecture might be. When he was expelled from the Bauhaus for fomenting the establishment of a communist cell within the school, he moved to Moscow with a number of his students and staff and embraced Stalinism with some enthusiasm. And that's a political decision, but on a personal level, he went on praising the glories of Stalinism long after he'd actually moved to safety in Mexico at the time of Stalin's purges, and he left behind his mistress and their son. His partner was actually murdered by the KGB, and the son sent off to an orphanage, didn't get back to Germany until he was in his 60s, and yet this individual was still praising Stalin's architectural policies. On other levels of inconsistency, this Aldo Rossi, one of the great writers about the nature of the historic European city, who was also perfectly prepared to work for Walt Disney. This exquisite sketch is a proposal for Disney's headquarters at Euro Disney, done for Michael Eisner, the architecture obsessive former chair of the Disney Corporation. At least Rossi had a sense of humour. He finally felt he could work for Disney no longer, not because he was worried about their cultural pollution, but because junior staff kept tinkering with his schemes. So he left, but composed a letter to Eisner in which he said, "It's been great working with you," I'm paraphrasing here, "but now it's time for me to leave. Clearly, there is something in the organisation which finds it quite hard to work with architects." And I find myself thinking about a previous Italian architect, Bernini, this is an image that he designed for Louis XIV for the Louvre. And so I, like Bernini, who I'm not comparing myself to, came to Paris and decided to leave without building. The trouble is, I am not Bernini, but you think that you are the King of France. This is an example of what Rossi built in Florida for the Disney Corporation. Again, there seems to be a huge mismatch between a scholarly appreciation of classical urbanism and what you can do with those elements in the middle of Florida. Or Michael Graves, another example of an architect who was enormously gifted at the start of his career. These beautiful, exquisite drawings, this idea of inventing a classically based contemporary language of architecture, who one could say was overwhelmed by success, by being flattered by Disney into designing one of their headquarters buildings here, this kind of laboured architectural pun, a giant order of dwarves holding up a Ledoux-like pediment. And so a once seriously talented, gifted architect seems now more likely to be remembered for designing giant hotels for Disney. Or a British example, this is Richard Seifert in the 1960s, the most successful British architect, bar none, one of the first large offices, who was best known for his ability to please his clients by extracting the maximum possible benefits from the planning system. But he's also an awful warning into how views about architecture can change. My generation grew up to see Centre Point in London as the epitome of all that was wrong with contemporary architecture. An intrusive building looming over the Georgian terraces of Bloomsbury, again, gross overdevelopment on a small site, and a bleak paraphrase of a much better building by Marcel Breuer. Of course, now Centre Point is a listed building and much exposed on brutalist fan sites on Instagram. Architecture has always been this dance between the powerful and the creative. To build at all, you need money, resources, and political ambition. And of course, this is something which has been used as an instrument of statecraft ever since Imhotep and the Egyptians, or in this case by Mussolini. I showed this image because there are so many which show groups of unsavory politicians clustered around models of their creations, which shows perhaps their worldview that they see their citizens as model-scaled figures. This is also an awful warning, sartorially speaking, for black shirts, not to wear black shirts over white trousers, not a great look. Here's another one. Of course, there are differences architecturally speaking. Mussolini was prepared to embrace rationalism. Hitler took a more folksy view of it. Here's a more recent terrible example of Saddam Hussein attempting to present himself as a faithful Muslim by building the world's largest mosque. Albert Speer was quite smart because he was very rarely photographed wearing a swastika and armband. He wore tweed a lot, but he was certainly working very closely with the Führer in competition with the Soviet Union's Stalin, who was another great builder for socialism. Note the rolled up architectural drawings in his arm, preparing to construct the socialist order. And here is the confrontation of these two systems in the 1937 Paris World's Fair with Boris Yoffan's Soviet pavilion with the worker and the peasant in their hammer and sickle on one side and Speer and his Nazi eagle on the other. And Boris Yofan, the figure talking to Frank Lloyd Wright, it's Olga Sasarufa, his wife, translating between them. Yofan is a fantastic example of what happens when a talented architect has to sacrifice everything of their talent in order to stay alive. This was the great building which Yofan never built. Stalin blew up the largest church in the Soviet Union in Moscow to make way for the so-called palaces of Soviets. It was a competition staged internationally. Le Corbusier, Gropius took part, but Yofan was always meant to win. He won with a three-level circular conference building and was given the commission, but only on the basis that he did exactly what Stalin told him, which was to extrude it into the world's tallest building and top it with a representation of Lenin on the scale of the Statue of Liberty. Or another example of architects who perhaps have managed to have lucky escapes, historically speaking. Mies van der Rohe, the third director of the Bauhaus, left Germany in 35, 36, but not before he tried to follow up the success of the Barcelona pavilion with this submission for a competition for the Brussels pavilion of 1934. You will note the swastika on the flag in the foreground, which luckily for him and his reputation, Hitler discarded and did not build. There are other people who shape architectural destinies and planning destinies. This image was taken in the 1964 New York World's Fair. This is the General Motors Pavilion, dedicated to the joys of motoring. And in this vehicle are what I call the three horsemen of the urban apocalypse. There's Robert Moses, who is the notorious city builder of New York, who built the city's parks, certainly, but he also made sure that the poor and the black couldn't get there by making sure that the roads out to the state parks had bridges too low to permit the passing of buses. There's Walt Disney, and in the front is Henry Ford II, the man who dedicated his career to building more and more cars. And I'm finishing with this image of Jane Jacobs as a voice who showed that communities can stand up and can change the ideas of those who seek to shape the world in unethical ways. Thank you very much.